I never considered myself a man of fortune or fame. To most, I was the quiet, calculated type, someone who let numbers speak louder than words. My life revolved around strategy, investments, and partnerships that demanded precision. I had no illusions about luck. Everything I achieved came from meticulous planning, sleepless nights, and calculated risks. That's why, when I met Daniel Cole, I saw more than just a business partner. I saw a mind that could match mine, a partner who could turn ambition into empire. Daniel and I built Cole and Mercer Ventures from the ground up. We started in a cramped office with peeling paint, a shared coffee machine, and a single dusty laptop. Within a decade, we controlled assets worth hundreds of millions, from tech startups to real estate developments. Everyone called us a dream team. Everyone except those who envied our synergy. I often told myself that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. Yet, somehow, I trusted Daniel more than I trusted anyone else in my life. He had a way of making you believe in the impossible, of convincing you that together, we were untouchable. But trust is a delicate currency. Spend it wisely and it can build kingdoms. Spend it recklessly and it can crumble the very foundations you stand on. Outside of business, I lived modestly, preferring my quiet apartment over lavish mansions. People assumed wealth changed a man, but I learned early on that character is revealed under pressure, not opulence. I kept my circle small, a few loyal friends, my sister who managed her own boutique, and Daniel, who was more brother than partner. But even in that circle, shadows lingered. Subtle resentments, unspoken jealousy, and quiet envy hid behind polite smiles and handshake agreements. I had learned to notice these shadows. They often whispered secrets louder than people ever would. Despite the veneer of control, there was always a part of me that wondered if I was vulnerable. Perhaps it was the awareness of how quickly alliances can fracture, how fragile the illusions of loyalty are. Yet I pushed those thoughts aside. The thrill of building something monumental was intoxicating, and I believed that, as long as I stayed sharp, nothing could touch me, not lawsuits, not rivals, not betrayal. Little did I know, the real test wasn't about markets or mergers. It wasn't about deals or profit margins. It would come in the form of Daniel himself, or rather, the aftermath of his absence. One cold December morning, I received a call that shattered my controlled world. Daniel was gone. No warning, no farewell, just silence and the echo of everything we had built together. I didn't yet know the storm that was coming. I didn't know that in the shadows of grief, I would discover treachery that cut deeper than any financial loss. And I certainly didn't know that the woman claiming to mourn him would be the architect of my humiliation. I remember the day with brutal clarity. The winter sunlight barely penetrated the blinds, casting cold, jagged lines across my office floor. My phone rang incessantly, lawyers, colleagues, even a distant accountant, but one call stood out. It was Victoria Cole, Daniel's widow. Her voice, polished and icy, sliced through the line. "You won't be getting a penny from Daniel's estate," she said casually, as if reading from a script. At first, I thought it was a sick joke. "Excuse me," I asked, my hand tightening around the receiver. "Oh, don't play the fool," she continued, a smile I could almost hear. "Everything is in my name now. Daniel made it clear before. The pause was deliberate, a dagger cloaked in civility. You'll inherit nothing, not a single dollar. Consider it final." I felt my stomach drop. A cold, nauseating weight settled over me. Everything we had built, our ventures, our savings, our future plans, supposedly vanished with a stroke of her pen. I wanted to scream, to demand proof, but Victoria didn't leave room for argument. After the call, I found myself sitting in silence, the office around me feeling strangely alien. The familiar hum of computers, the faint scent of coffee, the scattered reports on my desk, all of it now seemed taunting. The empire Daniel and I had constructed over years could be stripped away by someone who had only entered his life in the final chapters. I called my lawyer immediately, every second stretching like an eternity. That's when the numbers landed. Daniel's estate, $350 million, was mostly under her control. And, somehow through loopholes, omissions, and manipulations I couldn't yet fully grasp, I was left with a fraction, a mere $217,000. A joke, a mockery. I walked the floor, my mind racing through the sequence of events. How could Daniel, my partner, my friend, have let this happen? Had he really intended to cut me out? Or had someone exploited his absence, weaving deception so subtly that even I, a man who prided himself on reading people, hadn't seen it coming? I glanced at a framed photo on my desk, Daniel, and I at our first big office opening, grins wide, ambition tangible in the air. That image felt like a relic from another life, another reality where trust still mattered. The betrayal was suffocating. I realized then that this wasn't about money, it was about respect, recognition, and the principle that what we build together shouldn't be so easily stolen. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, hot and consuming. But I forced myself to remain calm. Panic would only cloud judgment, and rash action could destroy what little leverage I still held. Yet, under the simmering fury, a darker thought emerged, one I had to push aside for the moment: revenge. The days after Victoria's call were the hardest I had ever endured. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smug smile, heard the finality in her tone, and felt the weight of the world crushing me. My mind, usually sharp and decisive, became a storm of doubt and self-recrimination. I questioned everything. Had I been blind all these years? Had I misjudged Daniel? Or worse, had I misjudged myself? Every decision, every agreement, every handshake we had shared suddenly seemed fragile, meaningless. My sense of control, my carefully curated life, had been ripped away with a few words. And yet, deep down, I knew this was more than grief or anger. It was a test, a crucible revealing who I really was. I found myself replaying conversations with Daniel, searching for hidden hints, clues I might have missed. "Are you sure this is fair?" he had once asked in jest during a late-night meeting over budgets. I had laughed it off, assuming he meant the math. But now, the memory gnawed at me. Had there been warnings I ignored, red flags I dismissed, because I was too confident in our partnership? Anger and despair collided, leaving me teetering on the edge. Some nights, I cursed Victoria aloud, imagining confrontations that would never happen. Some nights, I cursed Daniel, wishing he had protected me, wishing he had left a direct path, rather than a tangle of legal loopholes and manipulations. I wrestled with bitterness, but I also wrestled with my own morals. I had never considered myself a vindictive man. I had always valued logic over passion. Could I really step into the shadows and play a game I had only observed from afar? The thought of revenge both terrified and exhilarated me. It was a dangerous intoxicant, filling the corners of my mind with possibilities. Yet I also feared what it might do to me. Would I become someone unrecognizable in my pursuit of justice? Could I balance the scales without losing the very principles I valued? I began to journal, scribbling everything: the calls, the meetings, my feelings of betrayal, every legal document I could get my hands on. I analyzed Victoria's moves like a chessboard, noting weaknesses, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities. At the same time, I scrutinized myself. Every hesitation, every fear, every temptation to act rashly, I cataloged them all. I knew instinctively that the line between victory and ruin was razor thin, and one wrong move could destroy everything, including myself. Late at night, I would pace my apartment, letting the silence press against me. The city outside hummed indifferently, unaware of my turmoil. And yet, in that silence, I realized something crucial: pain can either paralyze or sharpen. The betrayal had cut me open, but the wound was not fatal. It was a tool, a lens to focus my mind on a singular goal. I knew instinctively that raw anger would accomplish nothing. Revenge, if it was to be real, had to be precise, surgical, not messy. Victoria's arrogance was her weapon, but also her weakness. She believed herself untouchable, untethered by morality or scrutiny. That overconfidence would be the chink in her armor. I started by mapping everything: assets, accounts, shell companies, legal loopholes, and the network of advisors she relied on. Every detail mattered: her favorite lawyer, the bank manager who never questioned her instructions, the patterns in her public statements, even the way she flaunted her wealth online. Information was power, and I intended to gather enough to wield it without mercy. I reached out to trusted allies, discreetly. Old colleagues, consultants who owed me favors, accountants who had once worked with Daniel. Everyone who had insight, no matter how small, became a potential piece of the puzzle. I was careful to approach them under the guise of concern, nothing more. Victoria's instincts were sharp, and any hint of confrontation now would alert her. Patience was paramount. At night, I drafted scenarios, contingency plans, and escape routes. I imagined every possible reaction from Victoria, every legal countermeasure she could deploy, every subtle manipulation. I rehearsed conversations in my mind, anticipating lies, threats, and intimidation. The goal wasn't just to recover what was stolen. It was to make her regret ever thinking she could erase me. I also prepared myself mentally. The path ahead was morally gray, a labyrinth of deception and strategy. I had to remain calm, detached, and vigilant. Emotional impulses could ruin everything, and I couldn't afford missteps. I meditated, exercised, and even went back to old routines I had abandoned. A clear mind was my first weapon. One night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of financial reports, court filings, and personal notes. I drew diagrams, linked names to accounts, and highlighted potential weak points. It was like constructing a map of a city I had to infiltrate. Every line, every annotation brought me closer to the edge, closer to the moment I could strike with precision. And yet, beneath the meticulous planning, a darker thrill began to seep in. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, about proving to myself that betrayal could be answered with intelligence and patience. I felt a strange exhilaration, a quiet certainty that the scales could be balanced, that justice, my justice, could be exacted. By the end of that week, I had a plan detailed enough to impress even the most ruthless strategist. But I also knew it was fragile. One mistake, one underestimated move, and everything could collapse. Victoria had underestimated me once, but I would never allow a second mistake. The first move in any real revenge is invisible. No confrontation, no threats. Just pressure applied so subtly that the target doesn't realize the ground beneath them is shifting. That was my approach. Victoria didn't need to see me coming. She needed to feel unsettled, unsure, vulnerable. I began with the easiest thread to pull credibility. Quietly, I leaked questions, not accusations, just questions, to people who mattered. Bank compliance officers, a regulatory consultant I'd once helped out of a crisis, a journalist known for following money trails, not scandals. I never mentioned Victoria's name directly. I simply asked whether sudden estate consolidations after a partner's death usually raised red flags. They did. Within weeks, routine audits started appearing on her doorstep. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on paper, but enough to slow transactions, freeze timelines, and force explanations. Victoria's carefully managed financial momentum stalled. I imagined her irritation growing as doors that once opened effortlessly now required paperwork, signatures, patience. Next, I targeted her inner circle. Wealth isolates people, and Victoria had built hers on loyalty purchased, not earned. I reached out to her longtime legal advisor under the pretense of tying up loose ends from Daniel's side of the business. I asked simple questions, too simple. Questions that revealed inconsistencies in estate filings, missing documentation, unexplained transfers. I watched the advisor's confidence falter, just slightly. Doubt is contagious. Then came the smallest move, the one that hurt her pride more than her wallet. I declined a public acknowledgement. At a charity gala Daniel and I had funded years earlier, Victoria expected me to appear subdued, compliant, invisible. Instead, I didn't attend at all. My absence was noted. Whispers followed. People wondered why the surviving partner of a $350 million empire was being treated like a footnote. Victoria called me that night. Her voice was calm, but strained. "I hear you've been asking questions," she said. "I've been answering them," I replied. "People are curious." There was silence on the line. Not anger, fear. She didn't threaten me. She didn't insult me. She tried something worse, reassurance. "Let's not make this unpleasant," she said softly. That was when I knew the first phase had worked. If she were truly confident, she wouldn't need to soothe me. She wouldn't need to negotiate peace. She thought she'd already won. After the call, I sat alone in my office, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. I felt no joy, only clarity. This wasn't a victory yet. It was a test run. A signal, a warning shot fired without sound. Victoria had taken something from me and expected silence. Instead, I had given her uncertainty. And uncertainty, I knew, would eat at her far more viciously than anger ever could. By the time I made my next move, the game had changed. Victoria had begun to notice the cracks I had carefully created, and now she was reacting hesitant, defensive, frantic. That was exactly the point where mistakes became inevitable. And I intended to exploit every single one. I started attending the hearings in person. The courtroom was sterile, the air thick with tension, but I thrived in such environments. I observed every twitch, every glance, every hesitation from Victoria's lawyers and her own expression. She tried to maintain composure, but there was an unmistakable tremor in her voice when she addressed the judge. The empire she thought unassailable was beginning to look fragile under scrutiny, and I was the unseen hand guiding the collapse. One afternoon, during a deposition, I confronted her indirectly through her lawyer. I asked a simple question. Can you clarify why this transfer was omitted from the original estate filing? The room fell silent. Her lawyer stammered. Victoria's eyes darted, betraying panic. She wanted to strike back with confidence, with threats, but the evidence I had gathered, the precise chain of inconsistencies, left her trapped. Later, in a private corridor, I watched her as she passed by, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes revealed the storm inside. I could almost hear the thoughts she tried to bury. How did he find this? What else does he know? Am I in danger of losing everything I've manipulated into my possession? I pushed further, leveraging former allies who had grown uneasy with Victoria's control. Quiet phone calls, discreet questions, hints of oversight in her financial maneuvers. I let the rumor mill begin to stir. Every whisper, every uncertain glance added pressure, making her hesitate, doubt herself, question her decisions. And then came the confrontation I had been building toward for months. A closed-door meeting arranged under the guise of reconciliation. Victoria expected me to negotiate, perhaps accept a compromise. Instead, I laid the evidence bare before her top advisors, highlighting every manipulation, every inconsistency, every attempt to cheat me out of Daniel's estate. I spoke calmly, deliberately, leaving emotion out of it, letting logic and facts do the damage. Her reaction was subtle at first, a tightening of her jaw, a sharp intake of breath, but then the walls began to crumble. Advisors whispered among themselves, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and transfers. Victoria tried to argue, tried to redirect blame, tried to intimidate, but the web of deceit she had spun was now exposed, vulnerable to every skeptical eye. By the end of the meeting, the power dynamic had shifted entirely. She was no longer untouchable, she was cautious, cornered, forced to consider terms she had once scoffed at. And I, standing in the quiet aftermath, realized that revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about reclaiming control, asserting presence, and ensuring that justice, my justice, was recognized. The collapse didn't come with fireworks, it came quietly the way real consequences always do. One phone call at a time, one meeting canceled. One signature withdrawn. Victoria's world didn't explode, it shrank. And shrinking, I'd learned, terrifies powerful people far more than noise ever could. The first sign was the settlement proposal. Her attorneys framed it as practical and efficient. But I heard the truth underneath containment. They wanted to stop the bleeding before regulators, investors, and board members started asking questions they couldn't control. The number they slid across the table was generous by any standard. But it wasn't justice. It was an admission. I declined without hesitation. Not dramatically, not angrily. I simply closed the folder and said, "We're not there yet." That rattled them more than any threat could have. Over the following weeks, the fallout spread. A financial institution suspended its relationship with one of Victoria's holding companies pending review. A board she chaired requested an internal ethics audit. Invitations dried up. Her name, once spoken with admiration, was now followed by silence, pauses, careful wording. Reputation, I realized, is a currency more fragile than money. Once devalued, it's almost impossible to restore. Victoria tried a new tactic: victimhood. She spoke of grief, of being overwhelmed, of misunderstandings after a tragic loss. Some believed her, many didn't. The documents told a colder story: calculated transfers, selective disclosures, strategic omissions. Grief doesn't explain precision. As pressure mounted, people began distancing themselves. Advisors resigned for personal reasons. Partners invoked morality clauses. The empire Daniel and I had built, once so solid, was now being dissected under unforgiving light. I felt an unexpected ache watching it happen. Revenge, I discovered, has collateral damage. Even when deserved, it costs something. Then came the call I'd been waiting for. Victoria, no lawyers this time. Her voice was stripped of arrogance, raw with exhaustion. "What do you want?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence remind her how powerless she'd made me feel months earlier. Finally, I said, "I want the truth acknowledged, and I want what was taken returned, properly, publicly, and permanently." She didn't argue. She couldn't. In the days that followed, revised filings were submitted. Ownership stakes were corrected. Trust distributions recalculated. My name, once erased, was restored to the legacy Daniel and I had created, not quietly. Not privately, but in ink that couldn't be undone. Yet there was no triumph in it, only a steady, grounded calm. The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. Victoria hadn't been destroyed, but she had been exposed. And exposure, I knew, changes people forever. The document in my hands felt heavier than any check or contract I had ever held. Daniel's signature was unmistakable, final, and clear, a last act of loyalty I hadn't realized he intended. It wasn't just money. It wasn't just assets. It was validation. Proof that, despite deception, betrayal, and loss, justice could still be carved from the chaos. I sat alone in my office, the city outside blurred by rain. Silence had returned, but it was different now, charged, purposeful, not empty. I allowed myself a rare moment to breathe, to feel the quiet triumph that comes not from anger, but from strategy executed flawlessly. Victoria was forced to accept terms she had scoffed at months earlier. Her influence waned, her arrogance tempered by scrutiny she could neither control nor predict. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to humiliate her publicly. The exposure, the recalculated estate, the restored balance, those were more than enough. In the end, reality itself became the judge. I reflected on what this entire ordeal had taught me. Betrayal isn't always loud. It doesn't always hit with a blow you can see coming. Often, it's subtle, patient, hidden in the smiles and the documents, the words and the silence. And revenge, true, calculated revenge, is the same. It requires patience, intelligence, and restraint. Impulses destroy as easily as they avenge. I thought of Daniel, of the years we had built, the empire that now stood intact, partially restored to what it should have been. I realized that revenge, at its core, isn't about cruelty, it's about balance. It's about ensuring that injustice cannot linger unchallenged, that those who think they are untouchable are reminded of consequences, and that the truth, when wielded correctly, can be more powerful than any anger. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindictive satisfaction. Instead, I felt clarity. A life interrupted by deceit had been corrected, not violently, not impulsively, but with precision. And in that clarity, I found something more valuable than money: control over my destiny, and a renewed understanding of trust, loyalty, and human fallibility. As I locked the office door that night, I glanced at the framed photograph of Daniel and me during our first venture pitch. A smile touched my lips, not because of what had been taken, but because I had protected what truly mattered. My patience had turned betrayal into a lesson, injustice into strategy, and pain into clarity. I didn't need to look back. Victoria's empire was no longer untouchable. Daniel's legacy was restored, and my resolve was stronger than ever. Yet, deep down, I knew that life would always test those who trusted too easily, and I was ready for the next challenge, whatever it might be. True justice is not about vengeance. It's about restoring balance, learning from betrayal, and letting intelligence, patience, and strategy guide you through life's darkest moments.